"Your Wi-Fi is illegal." That's what she said, standing on my porch, with 2 sheriff's deputies behind her. I hadn't thrown a party, hadn't touched a neighbor, hadn't broken a single rule. I had set up a router, the same equipment sitting in churches, coffee shops, and 30 million American living rooms, fully certified, never once illegal. She's the HOA president. The fines are hers. The rules are hers. This entire neighborhood, for 6 years, has been hers. She had made families pack up and leave without ever raising her voice. Just paperwork, just pressure, just power with nowhere to push back against. 2 deputies, a clipboard, and a smile that had never once been told no. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, is that calling the police was the last move she ever should have made. She built this trap herself. What would you do in that moment? Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? To understand how we got here, you need to understand the neighborhood, and the woman who had appointed herself its unofficial warden. Ridgecrest Pines is one of those mid-2000s planned communities in central Ohio that was designed to look expensive and feel friendly, but managed to achieve neither. About 140 homes arranged in concentric cul-de-sacs around a retention pond the developer called an amenity lake, which is a fancy name for a hole in the ground that collects goose waste and runoff from the parking lot of the Discount Tire across the highway. The lawns are maintained to within a quarter inch of their lives. The mailboxes are a regulated colonial white, and there is a laminated sheet in every welcome packet explaining precisely how long your garbage cans may remain visible from the street after collection day. 2 hours. Exactly 2 hours. Someone measured. I moved in with my wife, Darlene, and our teenage son, Marcus, in the spring of 2019. We'd been saving for 6 years, and I want you to know that the moment I pulled that U-Haul into the driveway, engine hot, smelling of burnt transmission fluid and fast food wrappers, I felt genuinely proud. We weren't renting anymore. We had roots. I work as a network infrastructure technician for a mid-sized logistics company, have for 16 years, which means I know a thing or two about setting up a proper home network. Within a week of moving in, I had wired the house with Cat6 Ethernet, mounted a couple of access points in the ceilings for clean wireless coverage, and set up a small home server rack in the basement. Nothing exotic, just a NAS unit, a UPS battery backup, and a managed switch that glowed a very satisfying blue when all the link lights were green. Marcus called it the Bat Cave. Darlene called it the reason we can't park a second car down there. Both accurate. The first time I met Gretchen Albright, she was standing at the edge of my driveway with a clipboard. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at my gutters. "You've got a downspout that's angled toward the Hensley property," she said, without introducing herself. She wrote something down. Gretchen was the HOA board president, had been for 4 years running, and operated with the energy of someone who had been passed over for a middle management job in 1997, and had been avenging herself against the concept of other people ever since. She was tall, sharp-featured, always dressed like she had a 9 a.m. meeting that she had never stopped dressing for, and she moved through the neighborhood with a specific kind of authority that only exists when no one has ever meaningfully pushed back. She was also, I would later learn, the sole proprietor of 3 rental properties within the HOA, a fact that was, technically, in violation of the community's own occupancy rules, but which the board had quietly amended in a meeting with no public notice the year before I arrived. That downspout she flagged, I had it repositioned within the week. Friendly neighbor, following the rules, no problem. The second time she stopped by, it was about the color of my front door, a deep navy blue, lovely color, apparently 2 shades outside the approved palette. I repainted it, slate gray, per the palette. The third time, she left a note in my mailbox, which, I should mention, is technically a federal offense to use for anything other than USPS-delivered mail, but we'll come back to that, saying my holiday lights were up 1 day past the February 1st removal deadline. The lights had come down January 30th. I had photos. She sent a second note anyway. That's when I understood. This wasn't about rules. This was about who was in charge, and making sure I knew it. By autumn of 2019, Gretchen had filed 4 formal complaints against my property: the downspout, the door, the lights, and a brand new one about an unauthorized structure in my backyard, which was, I want to be clear, a garden shed from Home Depot that I had permits for, and which was, per every measurement I took with a tape measure, 3 feet inside the setback requirement. The HOA's grievance process worked like this. You received a written notice. You had 30 days to respond or remedy, and if you didn't, you got fined $25 per day. Every fine went into a reserve account managed by, and here's where it gets interesting, the HOA board president, Gretchen Albright, who had sole signature authority over that account. I hadn't figured out the full picture yet. At this point, I was just annoyed and confused. The way you get annoyed and confused when someone keeps finding reasons to knock on your door that technically have merit but feel deeply personal. You start second-guessing yourself. Am I doing something wrong? Am I a bad neighbor? My friend Curtis, who lives 4 houses down and has been in Ridgecrest Pines since the development opened, set me straight one Saturday afternoon. We were standing in his garage. The man restores vintage muscle cars as a hobby, and the smell of Bondo and machine oil hit you like a wall the second you step through the door. And I was venting about the shed notice when he just kind of laughed. She did the same thing to the Okafor family when they moved in, he said, using a shop rag to wipe his hands. And the Delgados before that. It's what she does with new people she decides she doesn't like. Files stuff until they either move or stop pushing back. Why does she decide she doesn't like people? Curtis gave me a look that said you already know why, and went back to his carburetor. I filed my response to the shed complaint with photographs, the permit documentation, and a surveyor's plot map showing exact measurements. By the book, completely compliant. The complaint was dismissed. 2 weeks later, Gretchen sent a letter, through the actual mail this time, certified, with a return receipt, informing me that my home network was in violation of HOA Regulation 7.4, which, she claimed, prohibited commercial-grade or business-classified telecommunications equipment from being operated in residential units without board approval. I read that sentence 4 times. I Googled HOA Regulation 7.4. HOA Regulation 7.4 is about landscaping lighting. Specifically, it prohibits commercial floodlights above 1,500 lumens from being directed toward neighboring properties. It says absolutely nothing about networking equipment. Nothing. Not a syllable. She had either completely fabricated the citation number, or she'd Googled the regulation list herself, found a number that sounded authoritative, and assumed I wouldn't check. I checked. I wrote back, politely, professionally, with a citation of the actual text of Regulation 7.4, and asked her to identify the specific provision she was referencing. She did not respond. What she did instead, about 3 weeks later, was show up at my door on a Tuesday evening with a man I didn't recognize and ask, demand, really, the word ask is generous, to inspect the telecommunications equipment in my basement. I told her that without a valid legal basis and without 48 hours written notice as required by the HOA bylaws section 12.2, which I had now read entirely, she was not entering my home. The man with her looked uncomfortable. He turned out to be a guy named Wendell, who ran the HOA's landscaping contract and had been drafted as a witness, which told me Gretchen thought this was going to go differently. She stood on my porch for a moment in that specific way powerful people stand when they realize their power isn't working. Stiff, slightly elevated on the balls of her feet, mouth set in a line. And then she said, "This isn't over." Which, honestly, probably the most accurate thing she ever said to me. I closed the door, went downstairs to the bat cave, poured myself a cup of coffee, black, because I'd been stress drinking too much sugar, listened to the hum of my server fans, and started thinking. If she was going to keep inventing regulatory violations, I needed to understand the actual regulations better than she did. Every single one of them, cover to cover. Because the thing about people who weaponize bureaucracy is that they almost never read the whole manual. And the whole manual, it turns out, is very interesting. I spent the next 2 weekends reading the Ridgecrest Pines HOA governing documents, the way I used to read technical spec sheets, methodically, with a highlighter, a notepad, and the particular patience of someone who genuinely enjoys finding where a system is broken. The documents were a mess, not in the sense of being short or vague. They ran to over 140 pages, but in the sense that they had been amended so many times, by so many different board configurations, that the original document and its revisions had started to contradict each other in ways that were either deeply incompetent or very deliberately convenient, depending on which rule you were trying to enforce. I found 7 outright contradictions in the first 50 pages. I flagged them all. More interesting, though, were the financial provisions. Per the original CC and Rs, that's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the founding legal document of every HOA, all dues collected by the Ridgecrest Pines HOA were to be deposited in a joint account, requiring 2 board signatures for any withdrawal above $500. The HOA had an elected treasurer. The treasurer, per the original document, held co-authority over the reserve fund. The 2017 amendment, the one that had quietly modified the occupancy rules to allow board members to own rental properties, had also, in its second subsection, removed the co-signatory requirement. 1 signature now, the board president's. The treasurer at the time of that amendment was a retiree named Harlan, who told me at the block party the previous summer that he technically held the title, but Gretchen handles all the actual paperwork. He'd seemed relieved about it. Harlan had no idea he'd been stripped of his legal co-authority by an amendment he likely never fully read. The 2017 amendment had also been passed at a meeting with 11 days' notice, rather than the required 30. I found the meeting minutes archived on the HOA website, buried under a tab labeled Documents, Miscellaneous. 11 days. The Ohio Planned Community Law, Revised Code Chapter 5312, requires 30 days minimum notice for any amendment to CC and R governing documents. This isn't a gray area, it's black-letter statute, which meant the 2017 amendment was potentially void, which meant Gretchen's sole signatory authority over the reserve fund might not be legally valid, which meant every transaction she had authorized from that account for the past 6+ years was worth examining. I sat with that for a while. I'm not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. But I know how to read a spec sheet, and what I was reading looked like a spec sheet for a system that had been modified without authorization, by someone who knew exactly what they were changing and why. I called a neighbor named Priscilla, who'd lived in Ridgecrest Pines for 11 years and had served on the original board before Gretchen's faction had outvoted her off it. Priscilla was a retired paralegal with the energy of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for someone to make exactly the phone call I was making. "Oh, honey," she said when I walked her through what I'd found. "I have been sitting on that 2017 meeting notice for 4 years, waiting for someone with the energy to do something about it." She had kept her copy, the original notice, mailed to all homeowners, dated 11 days before the meeting. She also had something else, her personal ledger from the years she'd served as board secretary, including a handwritten note about a $38,000 line item in the reserve fund that Gretchen had categorized as Infrastructure Improvement, Phase 2, in the 2018 annual report. Priscilla had asked to see the receipts 3 separate times. She had never received them. $38,000, categorized as Infrastructure Improvement, no receipts. We sat at Priscilla's kitchen table, the smell of her lemon verbena candles mixing oddly with the faint diesel exhaust drifting in from the road, with the documents spread out between us, and I had that very specific feeling you get when a system you've been troubleshooting suddenly shows you where the fault actually is. It's not satisfaction yet, it's colder than that, it's clarity. But here's the thing, clarity by itself doesn't fix anything. You need a triggering event. You need someone to make a move that justifies a response. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days after my meeting with Priscilla, I came home to find a notice from the HOA taped to my front door. Not mailed, taped, which is technically littering on private property, informing me that I had been reported for operating unauthorized RF emitting devices, consistent with commercial wireless infrastructure, and that the matter had been referred to local law enforcement. She had called the police, on my router. I want to describe the noise my server rack makes in the basement, because it matters for what comes next. It's a low, steady hum, not loud, not intrusive, the kind of white noise that blends into a house, the way a refrigerator motor does. The fans on the switch cycle up faintly when traffic spikes. The NAS drives spin with a sound like a very quiet card shuffle. When everything is running clean, which it almost always is, the whole thing just breathes. There is nothing illegal about any of it. I run a Ubiquiti Unify setup, prosumer-grade networking equipment that you can buy on Amazon, configure in an afternoon, and which is used by small businesses, schools, churches, and tens of thousands of technically inclined homeowners across the country. The FCC requires that Wi-Fi access points comply with Part 15 of its regulations, which govern unlicensed radio frequency devices. Ubiquiti access points are Part 15 certified. The FCC certification number is printed on the label on the back of every unit. This is not a gray area. This is a router. What Gretchen had apparently done, I found this out later, was contact a neighbor 3 streets over, a man named Derek, who had briefly worked as a telecom installer in the 1990s and retained just enough technical vocabulary to sound authoritative without understanding anything he was saying. Derek had told her, based on the strength of the Wi-Fi signal he could see on his phone while walking past my house, that I was broadcasting on commercial-grade spectrum, which is not a coherent sentence, but is the kind of sentence that sounds alarming if you don't know anything about wireless networking. Gretchen had taken Derek's assessment, written it up in a formal HOA complaint letter, citing a series of regulations that, again, were either fabricated or wildly misapplied, and filed it with both the HOA Enforcement Committee, herself, and the non-emergency line of the county sheriff's office. The deputy who showed up was named Flores. She was professional, a little tired, and had the look of someone who had handled a remarkable number of calls in her career that turned out to be nothing. She knocked on my door on a Wednesday evening, badge out, entirely polite. "Sir, I've received a complaint about unlicensed radio frequency equipment being operated from this address. Mind if I take a look at what you've got set up?" I said, "Sure, come on in, let me show you." I walked her downstairs. She looked at the rack. She looked at the access points mounted in the ceiling of the hallway. She looked at the labels on the back of the units. She took out her phone and photographed the FCC certification numbers. She was down there for maybe 8 minutes. Then she asked me if I had ever operated any equipment above the 30 decibel milliwatts EIRP threshold that would require an FCC Part 97 or Part 90 license. I told her no. My APs were running at 20 decibel milliwatts, standard residential output, well within Part 15. She wrote something in her notebook. Then she asked me to describe the complaint that had been filed against me and who had filed it. I walked her through it. I showed her the notice that had been taped to my door. I showed her the text of HOA Regulation 7.4, landscaping lighting, that Gretchen had cited as the regulatory basis for the complaint. Deputy Flores looked at that document for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Then she looked back at the document. "She cited a regulation about garden lights," the deputy said. "For my router," I confirmed. The deputy made a very small sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was the sound of a person exercising professional restraint. She went back to her cruiser to run some checks, and I stood on my front porch in the evening air, the leaves starting to turn, that particular October smell of cool earth and someone somewhere burning wood for the first time, and I watched her typing on her dashboard computer. She was in the car for 20 minutes. When she came back, her expression had changed, not dramatically, but her posture was different, focused in a different direction. She asked me if I knew whether the HOA had any registered telecommunications infrastructure. I asked her what she meant. She said that while she was running background on the property complaint, her dispatch had flagged something. There was a commercial-grade wireless repeater registered to a business entity at a property in Ridgecrest Pines. Not a residential router, an actual commercial device, operating without the residential variance it required under county code. She asked me if I had any idea whose property that might be. I told her I had an educated guess. Here's what Gretchen Albright had been running out of her house on Sycamore Terrace Court, 300 feet from mine. She operated a side business, not registered with the HOA, not disclosed to the board, not listed in any of the annual financial statements she had sent to homeowners, providing community internet services to 6 of her 10 rental units within Ridgecrest Pines. She had installed a commercial Cambium Networks PMP450 fixed wireless system on her roof. This is genuinely commercial equipment, the kind used by ISPs to deliver broadband to rural areas, with a transmit power output that exceeded what was permitted under a residential FCC license classification. Operating it required either an FCC Part 90 license or a county telecommunications variance. She had neither. She had, however, been charging her tenants $40 a month each for internet access, money that flowed directly to her, not through the HOA, not reported as rental income on the HOA's financial disclosures, while simultaneously enforcing HOA rules against homeowners like me for having networking equipment that was entirely legal and entirely within spec. Let that marinate for a second. She called the cops on my certified Part 15 compliant home router, which I used to watch football and help Marcus with his homework, while operating an unlicensed commercial wireless ISP out of her house. Priscilla, when I called her that night, made a sound I can only describe as triumphant exhaling. Deputy Flores had not cited anyone yet. She'd filed an information report and flagged it for the county zoning and code enforcement office, which would handle the telecommunications variance question. But she'd also, and this is the part that started a much larger clock ticking, asked me if I was aware of any connection between the HOA's financial reserve account and Gretchen's business operations. I told her I wasn't, but I knew someone who might want to look. Here is the legal and financial architecture of what we were now dealing with. 1. The 2017 CC&R amendment that had consolidated Gretchen's signature authority over the reserve fund was potentially void under Ohio Revised Code 5312 due to insufficient notice. If void, every transaction she had authorized unilaterally since 2017 lacked a valid legal basis. 2. The $38,000 Phase 2 infrastructure improvement, line item from 2018, which Priscilla had never received receipts for, now had a candidate explanation. Commercial fixed wireless equipment of the type Gretchen was running, towers, radios, cabling, installation, runs in the range of $15,000 to $45,000 for a residential scale deployment. 3. Charging tenants for internet service using HOA-adjacent infrastructure, even if the equipment was privately owned, without board disclosure, represented a potential conflict of interest violation under both the HOA bylaws and Ohio's nonprofit corporation law, under which HOA boards operate. The one-sentence takeaway, because you deserve it. If you live in an HOA, your state's planned community statute governs your HOA the same way corporate law governs a company, and board members have fiduciary duties they can be held to in court. None of this was going to be easy to prove, and Gretchen, I had no doubt, was smart enough to destroy or obscure records the moment she sensed someone looking. We needed her to feel safe. We needed her to keep making moves, and we needed a moment, a specific, public, documented moment, where everything came out at once, in front of witnesses, with no ability to spin it. That was going to take a plan. The next 6 weeks were the quietest I'd been since we moved in. I stopped filing responses. I stopped pushing back on notices. I paid the outstanding $25 fine on the shed complaint, which I still maintained was baseless, without comment. I smiled at Gretchen at the mailbox. I waved at her from the driveway. I was, to all appearances, a man who had decided that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. She sent 2 more notices. I responded to both with brief, compliant, entirely non-confrontational letters. I could see, even in the formal language of her replies, that she was recalibrating. She'd expected a fight. Getting compliance felt, to someone like her, like winning. Let her win. Meanwhile, the actual work was happening elsewhere. Curtis, who had connections at the county assessor's office through his day job as a commercial property inspector, quietly pulled the permit history on Gretchen's property and her 6 rental units. 0 permits for any telecommunications installation. 0 variance applications filed. The commercial antenna on her roof had been there, based on satellite imagery Curtis pulled from the county GIS portal, since at least 2018, the same year as the $38,000 reserve fund withdrawal. Priscilla contacted an attorney she knew from her paralegal days, a woman named Eugenia, who specialized in HOA disputes and had, in Priscilla's words, a deep and abiding hatred of fraudulent board governance. Eugenia reviewed the 2017 amendment, the meeting notice, and the Ohio statute. Her assessment: the amendment was void on its face. The corrective process required was a homeowner petition, 60% of deed-holding residents, demanding a special meeting at which the amendment would be formally rescinded and a forensic accounting of the reserve fund requested. We needed 60% of 140 homes, 84 homeowners. I want to tell you that everyone immediately rallied to the cause, and it was beautiful and easy. It was not. It was 47 conversations over 3 weeks, many of them held in garages and driveways and at Curtis's kitchen table, some of them with people who were skeptical, some with people who were scared, and a few with people who had been on the receiving end of Gretchen's targeting for years and were so ground down by it that they'd stopped believing anything could change. One homeowner, a retired pipe fitter named Beaumont, who'd lived in Ridgecrest Pines since 2006, teared up a little when I showed him the meeting notice and explained what it meant. He'd received a $2,000 fine in 2019 for unauthorized hardscape modification, a concrete pad for his generator, properly permitted with the county, and paid it because he didn't know he could fight it. He signed the petition before I finished my coffee. We got 89 signatures, 63%. The law here is elegant in its simplicity. Ohio Revised Code 531-2.10 gives homeowners the right to call a special meeting with a valid petition, and the board is legally required to convene it within 30 days. Gretchen received the petition, hand-delivered with a certified mail backup, on a Tuesday morning. I watched from my driveway. She stood at her door reading it for a long time. The telecommunications side was also progressing. The County Code Enforcement Office, prompted by Deputy Flores's report, had opened a formal case on the unlicensed commercial wireless installation. They'd sent a compliance notice requiring either a valid variance application or removal of the equipment within 60 days. Gretchen had hired a local attorney and filed a variance application, which bought her time but also created a public record of her admitting the equipment existed and was commercial grade. The variance application, which is a public document, listed the purpose of the installation as personal residential use. It said nothing about charging tenants. Meanwhile, I had filed a right-to-know request, Ohio's public records equivalent of an FOIA request, with the county auditor for all financial records associated with Gretchen's business entity, which I'd identified through her variance paperwork. The business was an LLC, registered in 2017, the same year as the amendment, the same year she'd gotten sole signatory authority over the reserve fund. I want you to understand the geometry of this. She had used an invalid amendment to give herself unilateral control of 140 homeowners' dues. She had then potentially used that control to fund commercial equipment for a private business she was running. She had then enforced HOA rules against other homeowners for equipment less powerful than her own. And when one of those homeowners started asking questions, she had called the police. The special meeting was scheduled for the third Saturday in November. We had a lot of preparation to do. Gretchen figured out something was happening around day 10 after receiving the petition. The first sign was a letter from her attorney to all petition signatories, a 4-page document asserting, with considerable legal-sounding verbiage, that the petition was procedurally invalid because it had not been submitted through the HOA's official grievance portal, a web form that Gretchen herself administered, and which had, conveniently, been temporarily unavailable for the previous 6 weeks due to unspecified maintenance. The letter suggested that signatories might face personal liability for any costs incurred by the HOA in responding to an improper petition. This was a threat, a transparent one, but a threat. Eugenia, the attorney, was not impressed. She sent back a 3-paragraph letter explaining that Ohio Revised Code 531-2.10 does not specify any required submission portal, that a certified mail delivery constitutes valid legal notice, and that the personal liability language constituted an arguably tortious attempt to intimidate homeowners exercising their statutory rights. She carbon copied the county prosecutor's office. The intimidation letters stopped, but Gretchen pivoted. She approached 4 of the petition signatories personally. I heard about this from Beaumont and from a woman named Claudette who lived on the East Loop, and told them, in a tone she apparently calibrated to be just friendly enough to be deniable, that she had heard some concerns about their properties being in the queue for HOA review, and that she'd be happy to look into clearing those up if there were any misunderstandings. Which is, if you want to be precise about it, a straightforward offer of quid pro quo. Remove your signature, avoid a fine. 2 of the 4 came to me immediately and told me what had happened. The other 2 withdrew from the petition. We still had 87, still above 60%. I documented everything, every conversation Beaumont and Claudette could recall, time-stamped and signed. Every letter, every response. I had a folder, an actual physical folder, printed, backed up to 2 separate cloud accounts, and a thumb drive that lived in my truck's center console. Because the one thing I'd learned from 16 years in infrastructure is that documentation is the last line of defense when everything else fails. Around this time, something else happened that I hadn't anticipated. The story, not the full story, just the Wi-Fi complaint story, shared by Deputy Flores's brother-in-law, who lived in the neighborhood and apparently found the whole thing hilarious, got posted to a local Facebook community group. Not by me. I want to be clear about that. I had been deliberately, carefully quiet. But someone posted it. It got 260 comments in 48 hours, and 3 local journalists reached out to me. I didn't respond to 2 of them. The third was a woman named Harriet, who covered municipal and community affairs for the regional paper, and who had, she mentioned in her email, previously written 2 stories on HOA governance disputes in Ohio. She was not looking for gossip. She wanted to understand the structure of what had happened. I asked Eugenia whether I should talk to her. Eugenia said, and I'm paraphrasing but barely, "Don't tell her anything you don't want in print." But having a journalist aware of a special meeting about HOA financial accountability before the meeting happens isn't the worst thing in the world. I had a 30-minute phone call with Harriet. I shared what was already in the public record: the petition, the certified copy of the 2017 meeting notice, the county code enforcement case, the variance application. Nothing that required attorney-client privilege to protect. Nothing that revealed what we were planning to present at the meeting itself. Harriet, it turned out, had already independently identified the LLC. She'd been doing her own reporting. "This is bigger than one neighborhood," she told me. Meanwhile, Gretchen made her most aggressive move yet. The week before the special meeting, she convened an emergency board session. Just herself, Harlan, the nominal treasurer, and a third board member named Dwight, who primarily showed up for the free food at quarterly meetings, and passed a measure indefinitely postponing the special meeting pending legal review of petition validity. She sent the postponement notice to all homeowners by email. At 10:47 p.m. on a Thursday, I forwarded it to Eugenia. Eugenia filed an emergency petition with the County Court of Common Pleas by Friday morning, citing Ohio Revised Code 5312.10 and asking for a court order compelling the meeting. She also moved fast. She included the intimidation letters, the documentation from Beaumont and Claudette, and a footnote referencing the pending county code enforcement matter. The judge granted the order by end of business Friday. The meeting would happen Saturday as scheduled. Gretchen had exactly one night to prepare. The Saturday of the meeting, I was up at 5, not because I was anxious. I'd been anxious for weeks and had burned through it. This was something quieter, the particular stillness you get when a long calculation is about to resolve. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window in the dark, and listened to the house. The hum of the server rack downstairs, the creak of Marcus's floor above me as he turned in his sleep, the distant sound of the highway. Darlene came down at 5:30, wrapped in her robe, and looked at me for a second. "You ready?" she asked. "I've been ready," I said. She poured herself a cup and sat down across from me. "Be careful with how you present this," she said. "You want people to understand it, not feel like they're being lectured at." She was right. She is almost always right about this particular thing. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the Ridgecrest Pines Clubhouse, a beige cinder block building with a drop ceiling and folding chairs, and a projector screen that took 4 minutes to descend when you pressed the button and smelled faintly of mildew. Eugenia would be there. Harriet from the paper would be there. Deputy Flores had agreed to be present in an unofficial capacity, not as law enforcement response, just as a citizen who'd been involved in the matter and wanted to observe. Curtis was organizing the homeowners who planned to attend. We had done something else too, which I want to explain carefully, because it's the piece that closed the trap. 2 weeks earlier, I had filed a request with the county auditor's office for a financial audit of the Ridgecrest Pines HOA Reserve Fund under Ohio's Planned Community Statute, which allows any homeowner to petition for an independent audit if they have documented reason to believe financial irregularities exist. The audit request cited the 2017 amendment issue, the unreceipted $38,000 withdrawal, and the existence of Gretchen's LLC registered in the same year. The county had fast-tracked it, partly, I suspect, because Harriet had also made a public records inquiry about HOA financial oversight in the county, and local officials tend to move faster when journalists are asking parallel questions. The audit was not complete, but a preliminary review had identified something significant, and the county auditor's office had agreed to send a representative to the meeting to present a summary of the preliminary findings. Gretchen did not know this. She knew about Eugenia. She knew about the court order. She had, I imagine, prepared a defense of the 2017 amendment, probably centered on the argument that no homeowner had formally challenged it in the intervening years, which creates something called laches, a legal doctrine that can bar claims that were unreasonably delayed. It's not a crazy argument. Eugenia had a counter-argument. It would have been a fight. But she didn't know about the auditor. She also didn't know that 3 of her tenants, people living in her rental units within the HOA, had independently contacted the county with complaints about being charged for internet service they'd been told was included in their rent. One of them had kept the text message exchanges, where Gretchen had confirmed the $40 monthly charge. These were not, technically, illegal under the terms of their leases, which Gretchen had apparently written to include a community services fee in the fine print. But they were relevant to any claim that the commercial wireless equipment was for personal residential use. Curtis had quietly made sure the folding chairs were arranged so that the podium faced the room with no easy exit stage left. The one thing I hadn't fully anticipated was what Gretchen would do in the hour before the meeting, when she finally realized how exposed she was. At 9:15, Harlan, the nominal treasurer, called me on my cell phone. He sounded shaken. She asked me to sign something, he said, a backdated authorization, for the 2018 withdrawal, saying I co-approved it. Did you sign it? I asked. Silence. No, he said, I didn't, but I wanted you to know she asked. Requesting that someone sign a backdated financial authorization document in the context of a pending audit is not just ethically problematic, it is potentially evidence of obstruction. I called Eugenia. I called Harriet. I sent a text to Curtis that said only, "Heads up, she knows." Then I drove to the clubhouse, found a seat in the second row, and waited. The projector descended. The room filled. The mildew smell mixed with coffee from the folding table by the door, and someone's cologne, and the general close warmth of 110 people packed into a room meant for 60. Gretchen walked in at 9:58. She saw the auditor's representative. She saw Harriet with a notepad. She saw Deputy Flores by the back wall. And I watched her face do something I'd only seen once before, on a network router when you try to push more load through it than it was built to carry. Every indicator light going amber at once. She tried to open the meeting by declaring it procedurally irregular and asking everyone to leave and reconvene after her attorney had reviewed the court order. Eugenia stood up before Gretchen finished the sentence. "The court order is not subject to your review," Eugenia said. Flat. Zero drama. Like she was explaining where the bathrooms were. "The meeting is called to order. Homeowners have the floor." There's a specific kind of authority that doesn't raise its voice, and Eugenia had mastered it completely. Gretchen looked at her, looked at the room. 110 people who had gotten up on a Saturday morning because they were tired of being managed, and she sat down. The first item was the petition itself. A motion to rescind the 2017 amendment on the grounds of insufficient notice under Ohio Revised Code 5312, restore the co-signatory requirement to the reserve fund, and request an independent audit of all HOA financial records from 2017 to present. Eugenia walked the room through the statutory requirement. 30 days notice required, 11 days given. She held up Priscilla's original copy of the meeting notice, yellowed at the edges, date clearly legible, and a printed excerpt of the Ohio statute. She didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. The vote was called. The tally. 94 in favor, 7 opposed, 9 abstaining. Motion carried. At this point, Gretchen attempted a procedural maneuver. She moved to table the next agenda item, the auditor's presentation, pending her attorney's availability. Dwight, the board's third member, who had been looking progressively more uncomfortable since the meeting started, seconded her motion out of apparent reflex. Harlan, quiet, 68-year-old Harlan, who had been stripping himself of authority for 6 years because it was easier, raised his hand. "I don't second," he said. "And I want to note for the record that this morning I was asked by the board president to sign a document backdating my authorization of a 2018 reserve fund transaction. I declined. I'm noting that publicly." The room went very quiet. Harriet's pen was moving. The county auditor's representative, a compact, steady woman named Yolanda, who had clearly done this kind of thing before, stood and delivered a 10-minute summary of preliminary findings. The $38,000 withdrawal in 2018 had been traced to payments made to 2 vendors. One was a legitimate landscaping company. The other was a telecommunications installation contractor whose invoice matched, in scope and equipment type, the commercial wireless system currently installed on Gretchen Albright's residential property, meaning the HOA's reserve fund, collected from 140 homeowners meant for community infrastructure, appeared to have been used, in part, to purchase the equipment for Gretchen's private internet business. Yolanda didn't say fraud. She said, apparent irregularities requiring full forensic audit. But the room understood what that meant. Gretchen stood up. She started speaking, something about how the equipment served community connectivity. And she might have gotten through that sentence if Deputy Flores hadn't spoken from the back of the room. "Ma'am," Flores said, calm as a weather report, "I'd recommend you stop speaking without your attorney present, for your own benefit." She stopped. There's a moment in every situation where the power dynamic finishes changing. Not gradually, the way it had been changing for weeks, but all at once, audibly, like a structural load finally transferring. This was that moment. 110 people felt it simultaneously. The room exhaled. The board voted, Harlan and Dwight both joining the motion, Gretchen abstaining, to appoint an interim 3-person financial oversight committee composed of Priscilla, Beaumont, and a homeowner named Tanya, who had a background in municipal accounting. The committee was given immediate access to all HOA financial records. Gretchen Albright left the building without a word. The door swung shut behind her, and outside, through the single window above the folding chair table, I could see her in the parking lot, standing beside her car, talking on her phone. She stood there for a long time. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I thought I might. What I felt was simpler than that, a tiredness that was actually relief, the specific muscular loosening of someone who has been braced for a long time and can finally stop. Marcus had come to the meeting. He was 17 and had sat through the whole thing with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the way teenagers do when they're trying not to look like they care. Walking out, he bumped my shoulder with his. "Pretty good, Dad," he said. "That's the mic drop. No special effects needed." The full forensic audit took 4 months. I won't walk you through every finding because some of it is still in litigation, but here's the shape of it. A total of approximately $44,000 in reserve fund withdrawals between 2017 and 2022 lacked adequate documentation, dual authorization, or a clear connection to community benefit. About $22,000 of that was ultimately traced to equipment and installation costs for Gretchen's private wireless network. The rest involved payments to vendors with connections to Gretchen's LLC, landscape consultation fees, administrative services, that the auditors characterized as lacking any demonstrable community benefit. Gretchen resigned from the HOA board in December, shortly after the County Code Enforcement Office denied her variance application and ordered removal of the commercial antenna equipment. Her attorney filed responses. The matter is civil and ongoing, which means I genuinely cannot tell you how it ends. But I can tell you that the Ohio Attorney General's Office, which has jurisdiction over nonprofit corporation misconduct, received a complaint referral from the county auditor's office, and those complaints don't typically go nowhere. The HOA elected a new board in January. Priscilla became board president. She declined any compensation beyond what the bylaws specified and insisted on a public meeting to ratify her acceptance. First thing the new board did, restored the co-signatory requirement, and appointed an outside accounting firm to handle all reserve fund disbursements. Second thing, eliminated the fine structure for first-time, good-faith violations, replacing it with a written notice and cure period. Beaumont got his $2,000 refunded. Gretchen's 4 complaints against me were formally dismissed and removed from my property record. Deputy Flores, when I ran into her at the gas station 3 months later, told me she'd been commended for the referrals she'd made on the code enforcement and financial oversight side. She seemed vaguely pleased about it in the way of someone who does not make a big deal of being right. Harriet wrote 3 stories. They ran in the regional paper, and 2 were picked up statewide. 2 other HOA communities in the county subsequently requested audits of their own reserve funds after reading the series. One of those audits found irregularities too. And here's the part I want to end on, because I think it matters more than the rest of it. The Ridgecrest Pines HOA, operating under Priscilla's board, took the recovered funds and allocated them to 2 things. First, real infrastructure, new playground equipment, repaved walking path around the retention pond, better exterior lighting in the cul-de-sacs, things people had been asking for years. Second, a small annual scholarship, $500 per year, available to any graduating senior in the neighborhood heading to a 2-year or 4-year program, vocational school, or trade certification. No GPA requirement, just a short essay about something you want to build or fix. Marcus applied. He's studying network engineering. He's going to be better at it than I am. Look, if you've lived in an HOA, you probably recognize something in this story. Maybe it's not Wi-Fi, maybe it's your fence, your paint color, your parking space. The mechanism is the same. Someone found a position that gave them just enough authority to make your life difficult, and they used it, not because the rules required it, because they could. The answer isn't to fight every battle. It's to read the whole manual. It's to know your state's planned community statute. It's to understand that HOA board members have fiduciary duties, legal ones, and that when they breach them, the law has remedies. 1-sentence takeaway, final one. Your HOA is governed by your state's planned community or condominium law. Find it, read it, and the person harassing you will never have as much power as they think they do. Asterisk.
She called the cops to take me down. Those same cops saw an illegal commercial antenna on the roof, but with HOA dues she controlled alone, authorized by an amendment that was never legal to begin with. She handed them the evidence herself. Here's the thing nobody tells you about people like Gretchen. They're not actually powerful. They just count on you never reading the document. One Saturday afternoon, one copy of your state's planned community statute. That's the distance between getting buried in fake violations and watching the whole thing unravel in a room full of witnesses. Petty power has an expiration date. It just needs someone willing to look at the label. If you're sitting in an HOA right now with a notice on your door that doesn't feel right, read your bylaws. Find your state statute, because the rule that protects you is probably already written down. You just haven't found it yet. Drop your HOA story in the comments. And if this one hits close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear it. She has 6 years of nobody pushing back. All it took was one person who read the whole manual.